Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to today's Center for Transportation webinar on the emerging future of supply chains. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the president and CEO of I'm really excited for this particular conversation. We have fantastic experts here to join us for obviously something very salient and relevant right now. For those who don't know, is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank, which helps shape the public debate on critical multimodal transportation issues while building a network of innovative transportation leadership professionals. Before we jump into the webinar, I just want to go over just a couple of very quick housekeeping items. You can answer questions in the box on the side of your screen at any time, and we will get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A section of the webinar. You don't have to wait until we're done to put in questions. And while we don't expect any technical issues, we have found that refreshing the page does tend to help any minor issues that come up for individual listeners. You can also click the help button on the bottom left for some more tips. And just so you know, is really happy to offer this webinar series free of charge. If you enjoy our webinars and you're interested in supporting Eno's work, you can donate or become a member of Eno today. You can do that all on our website at enotrans.org, where you can also find a recording of this webinar, which will also be mailed to all of you within a day, all the people who've registered within a day. So with that out of the way, I want to thank you all again for being here, and I want to turn it over now to the longtime Eno board chair, Lillian Borrone, who will serve as the co-moderator for this session. Lillian, take it away.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, everyone. I am Lillian Borrone, a former Eno board member and former assistant executive director at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. I currently serve as co-chair of Eno's Centennial Steering Committee. Eno is pleased today to have Anne Strauss-Wieder, Director of Freight Transportation at the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, here for this presentation. Anne will speak about her thoughts on the history and future of supply chains in the United States. Anne was the presenter of the Thomas Deen Lecture at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting in January. Today, Anne will discuss the challenges, evolution, opportunities, and achievements of the supply chain over time, and how it's positioned and what is needed to assure it can meet and serve the evolving needs of the 21st century, particularly as we face the global turmoil we're confronting right now. After Anne's presentation, I'll start the discussion with some opening questions. Rob will then moderate questions from the audience. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anne. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Lillian. Here's the good news. We don't have to explain what supply chains are anymore. Here's the bad news. We don't have to explain what supply chains are anymore. While the news has not always been favorable, it does mean that supply chains and the freight system are getting our attention. So in the next few minutes, as we think about the challenges facing us today, I'm going to take a step back in time to look at the challenges we have faced over the years and how we have met them both in the public sector and in the private sector and doing it together. I'll talk about the demands that we have placed on the freight system, how the freight system itself has evolved, and the evolution of conversations within the freight community. And again, with this understanding, it helps prepare us for the challenges of today and, for that matter, tomorrow. As I talk about these developments over the years, please keep in mind the three layers of freight movement. First of all, the physical movement of goods, all those different physical elements needed to move a product from origin to destination. Next, information flows. Now remember, we're going back in time, so think about paper and faxes, all those letters of credit, customs documents, transportation orders, everything that has to move in terms of information for goods to flow. And of course, government rules and regulations from international to local that set the playing field for the movement of freight. So with that, let's go back to the 70s and 80s. So what did we look like back then? Well, we produced a lot of stuff, whether it was automobiles or machinery, power, or big mainframe computers. And the established retailers? Well, I think many of us remember the Sears catalog and some of the other big retailers of the time. But they were facing changes. Walmart was expanding nationally. Price Club, Costco, also expanding. Staples was founded. Office Max, Office Depot, Home Depot, CVS, Ralph Lauren, Aeropostale, and even new channels on television, the QVC. And we were getting more connected. It wasn't just big mainframes anymore. Apple Computer was formed. IBM introduced the personal computer. Gateway, Dell, Northgate was formed. The first cell phone, admittedly several pounds and several $1,000s. The first use of a barcode. For a 10-pack of juicy fruit gum, that 10-pack's in the Smithsonian. An introduction of software for these new devices, such as Lotus 123. And we were changing. Back then, many of us or our family members would have worked in manufacturing or distribution, but that's been shifting. So instead of working on the manufacturing floor, we were now working more in services and office environment. With all these changes, there were disruptions in freight transportation, most notably the railroads, which had really been the highlight of the 19th century. But with the advent of trucking and other technologies, they were having issues and the public sector had to come to the rescue. For example, taking 7 bankrupt or near bankrupt railroads and forming Conrail in 1976. Meanwhile, a gentleman by the name of Fred Smith really didn't like the way his packages were getting delivered. So he got a few vans and a couple of small aircraft and formed Federal Express in the mid-1970s. He quickly realized that small aircraft just weren't going to cut it. So working with others and the public sector helped introduce air cargo deregulation that allowed the industry to start using larger aircraft, and thus was born an integrated intermodal company more concerned about when you got your shipment than how it got to you. And it wasn't just involving air and trucks. Malcolm McLean, the same gentleman who introduced containerization in 1956, started looking in the 1970s about those containers and whether they could be moved by rail, maybe as double stack, too high. Fast forward a few years, and American President Lines teamed with the railroads to introduce double stack land bridge service, which would not have been possible without such legislation as the Shipping Act. Indeed, federal legislation changed the playing field. The 3R Act and the 4R Act, which created Conrail and, for that matter, Amtrak. The Staggers Rail Act, setting the playing field again for railroading. The Air Cargo Act, think Fred Smith. The Shipping Act, think about those double-stack trains. And the Motor Carrier Act was essentially deregulated the motor carrier industry. Now, again, this legislation is primarily modal, but things were about to change as we moved into the 1990s. International trade bloomed with a lot of the changes going on a global scale. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The next year, Germany was reunified. The Soviet Union dissolved shortly thereafter. Shortly after that, the European Union was formed and introduced the euro. Shortly after that, Canada, Mexico, and the US signed the North America Free Trade Agreement. The World Trade Organization was formed. And with this global collaboration came a sharing of ideas. Now, Henry Ford may have introduced the production line, but in Japan, the idea of having inventory just in time for use really took hold in the auto manufacturing. And that information was shared in such publications as The Machine That Changed the World, and Just in Time became part of the culture. Indeed, that's a photo of Michael Dell. And when you placed your order for a Dell computer, it wasn't sitting there in inventory. It was assembled when you placed your order, which then meant that Dell computers had to rely on a very efficient freight transportation system to get you that machine in a timely manner. And what did we look like in the 1990s? We're still manufacturing a lot of things. And IBM, again, diversified, not just big mainframes, but those personal computers. But we're seeing retail at the top of the Fortune 100 with Walmart and Sears. And indeed, the big retailers, some of which we recognize here, Walmart and Sears and Kmart, the predecessor of Target, JCPenney. But there were still changes coming. A small bookstore decided to open up a website online, Amazon, taking advantage of the new internet availability. And in terms of retail, those that could not keep up with these trends began to fail. Woolworths shuttered their 5 and dime chain. And indeed, many of us received those floppy disks and those CDs from AOL or CompuServe urging us to get online. Yahoo had a search engine. 2 guys in a garage formed a company called Google. Cell phones could get email and text messages and actually hold on to the internet. And a document was released called How to Timestamp a Digital Document, the front runner of blockchain. And as international trade grew, production lines became much longer. Instead of several hundred miles, there were several thousand miles, and more goods needed to move. In 1980, a typical container vessel had about 4,100 TEU capacity. That's 20-foot equivalent or 20-foot containers. Less than 20 years later, double that capacity. We'll jump to 2021, and the Al Jazeera is able to hold 24,000 TEUs. And warehouses began to shift in function. It wasn't just a rebranding to distribution center. We may have thought of warehouses as that place in the last scene of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Ark of the Covenant was lost forever, but they changed, particularly with the lengthening of supply chains and the bifurcation of the production process. So that last customization and assembly happened in these buildings, and they grew in size and importance in function. And if you want to get a sense of where the technologies of tomorrow will be in the transportation system, go into a distribution center or a fulfillment center today and look at the technologies already in use. The railroad industry, in such a state just a decade ago, was reinvigorated. The Burlington Northern and the Santa Fe merged. The UP and the Southern Pacific merged. Conrail was acquired by Norfolk Southern and CSX. And by the way, paid back the federal government quite handsomely for the investment made in it. And the federal legislation changed the playing field again. The interstate system was largely completed, and we went intermodal. We got away from modal silos, and we started thinking about freight in terms of local impacts and how to involve the public and broaden the audience for conversations about freight and other forms of transportation. And this is where we see a real blossoming of conversations and investigations through Transportation Research Board or or any of the academic communities, really developing that understanding that we had a system of systems. And now we move into the next century. And as we enter the 21st century, probably the first major item that we will always have in our minds is that terrible day on 9/11, the terrible loss of life, and also a recognition that transportation, equipment, and cargo could be used as weapons of mass destruction. Coming out of that horrible day came new requirements on the movement of cargo, recognizing what it could be used for. So knowing every aspect of the move, knowing who your shipper was, 100% screening of anything being loaded on aircraft, following every movement, every mode through, And while there was some initial thinking that this could be an impediment to the movement of goods, it actually, over the long term, created new efficiencies in products. Because as the private sector deep dived into creating that connectivity, they found new efficiencies and new products, such as on the far left, geofencing to track the movement of trucks, to see if they were on track to get to their destination. And if they left that virtual fenced area, was it because of traffic or something more nefarious? And it provided us with real-time tracking information for all those packages that we're getting at home these days. Unfortunately, 9/11 was not the only major disruptive event that we've seen in the 21st century. We've seen hurricanes, tsunamis, meltdowns, the explosion in Beirut. And as we've encountered these terrible disruptions, we've learned to increase our resiliency, whether it's strengthening our infrastructure or strengthening our ability to pivot and to collaborate and coordinate and communicate to work our way through these situations. And with every event, we emerge stronger, knowing what we may need to do for the next unanticipated event. And what did we look like in 2010? Well, Walmart, top of the list in the Fortune 100. And yes, we're doing energy production and still electronic equipment, but we have a bank in there. And freight movement became a market strategy with the introduction of Prime by Amazon in 2005. For one fee a year, whether you're in a rural location or an urban location, you essentially got free delivery of all your packages purchased through Amazon. And that became the new bar for the retail industry. If you could not offer a service like that, either on the internet or that free delivery, you were not going to survive. And indeed, the landscape shifted. Levitt's Furniture, bankrupt. Circuit City, out of business. Borders, gone. Sports Authority, gone. Radio Shack, a memory. But we continue to grow, and also because we wanted things as inexpensively as possible, and as demanding consumers, we wanted access to everything. International trade continued to grow, and we had to think about our infrastructure. And here's a picture on the top right of the Teddy Roosevelt on her maiden voyage to the port of New York and New Jersey, going under the newly raised Bayonne Bridge to accommodate this larger Neo-Panamax vessel, also in a deeper channel. And that picture on the bottom, while not calling on the East Coast ports, is that 24,000 TEU vessel that came into service last year. And distribution centers also became fulfillment centers, fulfilling the orders that we placed online with, again, new technologies and efficiencies. For example, it was discovered that workers were walking up and down the aisles to pick our products for us. So first Kiva Robots, and then that was acquired by Amazon Robotics, designed a system to bring the racks to the workers. Everything organized for efficiency and controlled by warehouse management systems, a merging of information and physical movement. And as our demands on the system changed, we've seen a change in the freight providers in this new century. Amazon is perhaps our first hybrid shipper and transportation provider, offering Amazon Prime delivery to our homes, the larger trucks we now see on the roads, and indeed Prime Air. And those last mile deliveries, whether we're talking Uber Eats or Instacart, or any of the products that deliver goods directly to us, the consumers. And with transportation, technology, and information improving, we saw the introduction of new advances. Now, the first autonomous truck was delivering Budweiser and Coors Company and country, and the first drone was delivering beer to ice fishermen. This is not an indication that beer is a leading indicator of technological change, just saying. But we are seeing more introduction and experimentation of autonomous or semi-autonomous trucks. Zipline, which is pictured here on the bottom left, started as a way of getting critical medical supplies to disrupted areas in Africa. More recently, they've teamed with Walmart for delivery of packages to customers in Arkansas. And in terms of last mile delivery, those cute sidewalk robots, more commonly found these days on college campuses, but occasionally now in the occasional city by Starship or KiwiBot. And in Scandinavia, the first electric automated cargo vessel was launched. We've always focused on greater environmental sustainability and being as carbon neutral as possible. This is something businesses are demanding and the supply chain is implementing. There were already practices for the recycling of material and energy savings within industrial buildings. But now look at any on a Google flyover and you'll see miles of solar arrays on the roof. And in terms of delivery vehicles, Federal Express, UPS, and Amazon Prime ordering lots of electric trucks. We see these more commonly now in delivery vehicles because they go home at night and can charge there. In longer distance truck, the eCascadia, the electric truck, which is being prototyped on the West Coast and will be in New Jersey, as well as CNG trucks. Now, I've seen those recently with UPS and Prime, probably going from one Amazon facility to another or a UPS facility to another because they know they can charge there because we still have to work on the infrastructure. And this wasn't just limited to industrial buildings or trucking. We see this on the railroads and in aviation. And again, that meeting of virtual and information. The 21st century has seen a lot of recalls of food products, whether it's peanut butter or spinach. So the need for tracking all our food supply chains from the very field, at the very farm, the very location where it was grown, all the way to the delivery location, to the store, to the shelf. So if you have to pull it, not only can you track all those moves, but you know where the infection occurred. And blockchain has made a big difference. And we see with the complexities of international trade, the creation of TransLens, which was started with IBM and Maersk and is now used by several companies. And in the middle of, I think it was 2015, the Young Professionals Group at TRB selected Transfix in their 6-minute pitch because this was a company that was putting forward a means for a load matching for trucks to reduce the empty miles that drivers were encountering and creating efficiency. Transfix is now worth several $100 million. So here we are today in a persistent pandemic, tremendous fractures, and again, the need for some new thinking. Indeed, international trade, which was encouraged for so long, has been unraveling. Perhaps starting with the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been viewed with some alarm. The move by the UK to leave the European Union, Brexit. The introduction of tariffs in 2018, the global pandemic of 2020, and the Ukraine invasion most recently. The global pandemic, which has now claimed over 6 million lives, has been a terrible disaster. From a supply chain perspective, it was an abrupt change in the demand for certain services and products. We were all looking for more personal protection equipment, cleaning supplies, toilet paper, and we wanted things delivered directly to us. At the same time, the supply chain industry had to meet those challenges where offices and restaurants were closed. Production facilities were closed. So there were canceled vessel movements. But then there was pent-up demand. And all of a sudden, when those production facilities came back online, the demand to get that cargo to those customers as quickly as possible. We can't just talk about e-commerce as those little packages coming to our homes because we were ordering food, and gym supplies and furniture. So we're now talking about a direct-to-consumer market. Now, at the end of 2021, e-commerce, and we'll just call it now direct-to-consumer, anything we purchase online, represented still a little over 19% of all retail sales. But it is a growing market that we need to be aware of from a freight perspective as well. And indeed, one thing that had just started but really hadn't caught on before the pandemic was buy online, pick up in stores, BOPIS. It's going to be in your vocabulary. Here's an example with groceries. And if you look at the far left, that was online purchases of groceries, either that we picked up curbside, BOPIS, or delivered to our homes in 2019. And look at the end of 2021. We found this was very efficient. And it didn't cost us anything more, but it saved us time. So here's something that came to stay, was accelerated by the pandemic. And indeed, that change really affected the grocery industry and the supply chain because grocery stores were never set up for that kind of fulfillment center function. So companies emerged, such as Takeoff, that created micro fulfillment centers with automation that could pick up the most delicate fruit or vegetable and help pack it to address our need for BOPIS. And that fracturing of international trade, first of all, we had to rethink inventory. Just in time wasn't going to cut it. But also with the disruptions in international supply chains, and think back to 2011 and the terrible disaster in Fukushima, Japan, we could no longer have just one location in the world for the production of a particular commodity. So whether we're talking pharmaceutical products or furniture, a real rethinking of a diversification of production locations, and for those critical supply chains, the need for increasing our domestic production capability. Indeed, the federal actions that we've seen over the last year or so really focus on those critical supply chains. The first executive order in 2021, looking at critical supply chains, asking for a 100-day report and a year report, which is available online. The IIJA not only invests in all forms of infrastructure, but focuses on some of those freight issues we've had for a long time. For example, creating a pathway for under 21 responsible drivers to get their interstate CDL, which you need even to move a container within a state. It also addressed a critical issue in terms of truck parking for the driving community, requiring that every new state freight plan that needs to go to the federal government this year include an assessment of truck parking. Also recognizing that we have to figure out how to attract and retain drivers. There was the Biden-Harris initiative announced in December of last year with a particular focus on underrepresented demographics. Women were only 7% of the trucking workforce, minorities under 40%. And what do we look like today? We've got only one production company in there, that's Apple. But Walmart and Amazon and 2 healthcare companies rounding out the Fortune 5. So how do we approach the future? With the same determination that we have in the past. And with that collaboration and the coordination and the communication between public and private, between entities, I think we're well set to take on the challenges of today. So with that, I thank you, Eno Foundation, for letting me make this presentation today, and to TRB for the great honor of providing the Deen Lecture for 2022. And Lillian, back to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. While we're waiting for Lillian to jump back on, just want to thank you for that fantastic presentation and for making it so simple and straightforward. These issues of freight and supply chains can get so complex and really arcane, I think, to a lot of people, especially a general audience. So I think just want to thank you personally very much for boiling that down and for the clear delivery. So I know we have Lillian back on, so let me just turn it over to her.
Thanks, Rob. I'm sorry. I apologize, everyone. And your last slide, and also when you spoke about resilience, you talked about the 3 C's: collaboration, coordination, and communication. And you also talked about innovation, as important as we deal with the future, as we face what we've got coming at us. Can you give us a few examples of what you think you see on the futures as you look at the future in terms of the new relationships between the public and private sector beyond the legislative areas that you just mentioned?
Thank you, Lillian. For one example, I'll go back to Superstorm Sandy. And Superstorm Sandy in the New York, New Jersey area really hit us in an unanticipated way, maybe about 24 hours notice. And it hit during the peak of the peak shipping season. And everyone worked together, whether we were talking IOA or the terminal operators, the public sector, the private sector. Everyone came together to bring the port back online. And it was that kind of collaboration and coordination, and also knowing how to communicate, because people knew who to call and how to reach each other when your cell phone service was out and there was no power. But that kind of collaboration and coordination and communication gave rise to the Council on Port Performance and really showed that there were ways that everyone could work together for common goals. And it does involve a number of public entities as well as the private sector. And I will never forget the last in-person meeting of the Council on Port Performance in February of 2020, when they already knew there were going to be canceled sailings, but we're already talking about the fact that there was going to be a surge as the pandemic ebbed. And this was February of 2020. So in many ways, the port started preparing for this, which may explain why the Port of New York and New Jersey had none of the kind of backup that we saw on the West Coast. And I think that kind of coordination and collaboration and communication also helps set us up to deal more effectively with something like the global pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example, but I think what it also reinforces in my mind is the fact that the public agencies, your agency and others, were collaborating with one another, but also with the private sector, and that the private sector knew that they could turn to public service agencies to work in a collaborative fashion. So it's a model that I think we definitely need to see replicated in other areas, or we need to learn from some other models that we may see in other parts of the country. And you touched on something else I'd like to just go back to for a minute before Rob opens it up to the full audience. You recently served on the U.S. Department of Commerce Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness, and you chaired the Workforce Subcommittee. And I know that you mentioned in your presentation and talked about in specific some of the evolving technology solutions and demands that necessitate a different kind of workforce in the supply chain. I think that is working closely with many agencies on workforce solutions. But I'd like to know how you see the evolving technology advances impacting the industry workforce, and what recommendations did your subcommittee identify that you advocate that we should be paying attention to?
Well, let me take that in 2 parts. And in technology, let me talk about automation, because automation comes up quite a bit. And there are 2 forms of automation. There's automation that replaces workers, and then there's automation that changes the nature of the job. Nearly all of the automation that we've seen implemented is designed to change the nature of the job, to create situations that are safer for workers, particularly in a post-pandemic environment where the health and safety of our workers was number 1 during the pandemic. But we have to consider moving into the future and removing those repetitive positions. I remember visiting GCT Bayonne, a major container terminal in the Port of New York, New Jersey. It used to be that longshoremen had to climb up into these straddle loaders, and one of them said 85 steps in all sorts of icy weather, and then be face down in a very odd position to move cargo to prepare it for being loaded onto trucks or offloaded from trucks. And that stacking system is now automated. So based on a truck appointment system, overnight the system knows how to set up the containers. Are there less IOA workers? No, they're not. They're not in those machines anymore. They're in an office setting, in ergonomic chairs, and they're handling the last few feet between the automated equipment and the truck in a safe manner. So their job situation has improved dramatically, and the safety and the efficiency has grown. So that's one example of where you see this change in technology. In terms of recommendation, and it was such an honor to serve on that advisory committee. And I do want to thank all the folks at Department of Commerce, as well as the people, particularly on the workforce subcommittee, who were so devoted to this critical issue. And we started out by first saying, what's the nature of the trouble? And one of it was marketing, supply chain, and freight, which at the point nobody had heard about, and we don't have to explain it anymore. At the same time, we have to talk about all the range of occupations available for people in this field and the career ladders that are possible. Second was looking at training and apprenticeship programs and how that gets done. Then there was impediments, and we've talked about truck parking, but also importantly, as we talk about this shift to fulfillment centers and distribution centers and these new locations of employment, it's how do you get from where you live to where you work? Because if you can't do that effectively and cost efficiently, you're not going to take that job. So we focus on those kind of issues.
Thank you. Rob, let me turn back to you. I know you have many questions from the audience.
Indeed, we do. They're coming in. They're coming in fast now. I want to encourage everybody on the webinar to use the questions function there and drop them in. We'll try to group some of these together. And let me just start with one. And a lot of folks seem to be asking questions about the state role here. So we talked a bit about what the federal government is doing. You talked about the IIJA. But the states have such a profound role to play in many places. Cities own ports. So how does the sub-national level, how do we think about what policy responses are necessary now to deal with some of the problems we're facing today?
So we can start at the state level and then go down on level. State levels, we can talk about investment, we can talk about encouragement of programs. Lillian touched on it, that collaboration and coordination, because it may be state entities or regional entities that are operating the airports and the seaports and the roadways. It's that collaboration between public and private to optimize all aspects of the freight system. Not focus on one mode versus another, but what's out there. And then thinking about the trends and the public goals as well. Whether we're talking about encouraging the use of alternative fuels or addressing truck parking. A lot of this has to occur at the state level or through organizations like the Eastern Coalition, where you have a multi-state, or in our area, we have the MAP Forum, which is a coalition of 10 MPOs in 4 states. So again, that's that collaboration, coordination, communication. But let me go all the way down to the local level. Because at the local level, there can be zoning laws and other requirements that can affect how goods move. For example, restrictions on noise. Because if you may think, hey, that's great. We'll have the trucks move at night. But wait, they can't offload in a loading dock because that could really affect the neighbors. So we have to think about that. And again, at a state and local level, what are your truck routes? How do you handle it? And from a private perspective, this is all those practices about freight being a good neighbor. How can it add value to the host community rather than be considered an issue? And if there are issues, instead of saying, I've got a problem, it's working together to say, here's a situation, here are effective practices, let's figure it out. Local level and urban areas, think at all the great ideas that are coming out of a lot of locations in the US and overseas. with all that last mile delivery to us consumers, and thinking through curb space management and actually what happens on your sidewalks. So there's a lot that happens at every single level that affects the movement of goods.
Got it. And let me ask about some specific modes. I know folks are curious about specific modes, but let me start with one big, broad question. You mentioned that something, I think early on, you talked about how we were formerly siloed, I think, in the freight network. And you may have been referring to kind of the intermodal nature. We move things from one mode to another. But how do you think about the siloed nature of the freight system in the United States today?
I'm not sure how siloed it is anymore, especially when I look at a company like Amazon that's a hybrid shipper and transportation provider. We're in an era of tremendous change. Think about it. I just gave that example of BOPIS and all those last mile delivery companies that are showing up at our door right now. And from a public sector standpoint, we have to think through, are we capturing those freight flows? And you talked about local communities. How are they handling all these movements? We still talk about the railroads. We talk about air cargo. We talk about using all the assets we have as effectively as possible. There's talk about marine highway, making better use of our waterways. So I would like to think that we still think of it, at least nationally, as a system of systems. And also understanding that freight is a derived demand. Freight doesn't move because it decides one day to go from one place to another. It is responding to where production locations are, where distribution locations are, and where the customers are. So it's a critical component when we start talking about expanding domestic capacity in certain areas, making ourselves competitive in a world environment, and also doing all this in a manner that is environmentally sustainable and considers equity issues.
And that actually leads into the next question. I think a couple of folks were asking about railroading in particular. I think obviously from a climate perspective, there's a lot of framing around railroad as a climate-friendly solution. How do you think about the future of railroads and freight over the next 20, 25 years?
I will mention that one of my first jobs when I was still in college was working for Conrail, so I was an ex-con. So I would like to think I'm on the right track here. But there clearly is a role for railroads. They certainly historically have played a huge role in the national economy. And particularly now for the long distance movement of cargo, they are a very effective mechanism. We've seen some bifurcation occur where we have the big class ones and we have the short line or regional railroads. And particularly as we look at more domestic production, we're probably going to see a need in some cases for greater movement direct to certain locations. So is there a future to the mode? We keep adding freight providers. I don't think we've actually taken one away yet. One could argue about canals, but I think even there, you still see them used occasionally for cargo movement.
That's very good. Let me go back to another one of your comments that someone was asking about just-in-time delivery. I think you mentioned, I think I heard it right, that you kind of mentioned it in the past, that it's not even fast enough, I think is the way you kind of described this going forward. So how do we think about just-in-time delivery as a freight strategy today? And what's the future of just-in-time delivery going forward?
Just-in-time strategy works when you know the supplies are going to be there when you need them. But we have a fracturing occurring and we have very long production lines. And we're seeing this now. It's kind of the comment of the day, what are we missing? Whether it's, I remember last year, one of the developers saying, I can't get bathtubs, or now you can't get windows, or I can't get lumber. When you have those kind of situations, we are so used in our lifetimes of having everything available, and now we don't. So we have to think both in terms of our routine lives and whether we have enough on hand. But then we also have to think about those critical supply chains that are necessary for our national health and well-being. And one thing that came out very early on during the pandemic, because people were already thinking about vaccines, is we didn't make enough syringes or needles or vials to be able to get the doses out there. So you saw BARDA and others not only reserving capacity, but beginning to invest in increasing domestic capacity, and not just in the state of the art, but going one step further. For example, encouraging the development of those glass vials, but perhaps in different layers of glass or layers of glass and plastic that reduce breakage and transport, or new ways of producing certain commodities in a way that could pivot really quickly when we have the kind of situations that we have today.
Got it. So how do you think the last mile providers are going to change their business models with reflect to reflect the volatility of fuel prices? This is a big conversation going on here today. The price of fuel, what's going to happen to it? How does that affect the last mile kind of element of this supply chain?
We've seen some of these practices before. Automated package lockers, for example, where Amazon or UPS will say, hey, you're not going to be home? Have it delivered to this convenient location and get the package in a locker, or go to a UPS store and get it there. So I think there's going to be more encouragement of us going to these locations, because then there's one truck doing multiple deliveries to a single location. It's more efficient and it saves energy. I think, like you, we're all taking a look and wondering what this means long term, whether we're talking freight movement or just going to work. And going back to my childhood, and my first ability to drive a car was Dad saying, hey, you can go drive the car and get in line at the gas station, because there was depending on your license plate, when you could get gas. So I don't think a lot of people remember that, but we've been through this kind of situation before. And again, let's hope that we're talking about something that's short-term in nature.
Got it. Here's a question that's right out of my close to my heart, and maybe close to yours too, I think, and given your job now. So how do we better leverage shared data about freight to better understand what's happening on the ground for policymaking and planning? I think a lot of the work that we've done, and I think you may agree, some of the freight data, given the decentralization, is hard to get your arms around and anything comprehensive. So how do we think about the future of data related to freight?
First of all, we have to identify what are the critical questions we need answered. What are those key decision points, and what's the information we need for that? Where is there a shared need for that information, and how can it be collected in a manner that's consistent with keeping confidentiality for certain businesses? Other sources of information, we keep finding new ones. When NJTPA did its most recent freight forecast for our long-range plan, a federally mandated long-range plan for 2050, we wanted to capture those new last-mile deliveries. So we found new data sets that we could acquire, so we could factor in those additional truck movements into decisions, because we realized we were missing those flows in looking at where investments had to be made. So it really comes down to those critical questions, working collaboratively on that key information, and then going back to something Lillian said as well, is working together on what the possible solutions could be. So, and in some cases, in the private sector, it's a green, yellow, red dashboard. What's working, what's not working.
Actually, it reminds me of a question that came on earlier, and I don't know quite how to phrase this, but given the freight system in the United States, you went through it all very, very clearly, very complex, highly decentralized, messy in a lot of ways. I mean that not pejoratively, but it's got a lot of components to it. How does the freight system in the United States compare to others internationally? Are other countries, China obviously is a different model, but are other countries similarly decentralized like we are here in the United States when it comes to policies and practice around freight?
I suspect there are people on this webinar who can tell us even more, but we all learn from each other. We learn about the effective practices, whether we're talking about urban freight movement and what's been done overseas and what's applicable here that can work over there. environmental sustainability practices. Each country is different in their rules and regulations and how freight moves. But again, I think everyone takes on their challenges and figures out what works best.
I wasn't sure if I was going to ask the question. Didn't know if you knew about what was going on internationally. And the global nature of this makes it certainly complicated. What about Amazon particularly? I mean, you clearly went through, the role of different firms and innovations have had in the history of this here in the United States. Has Amazon specifically, do you think, been helpful or not so helpful in thinking about the future of the supply chain?
Amazon is the latest to challenge us in our thinking about supply chains, but they weren't the first and they certainly aren't going to be the last. We can go back in history and talk about the formation of the B&O Railroad and why it was formed to compete with the Erie Canal. We can talk about the introduction of all those retail changes in the 70s and 80s. So, this is where it gets very interesting because freight transportation and supply chains are dynamic and ever-changing. And the private sector moves much more quickly than the public sector. So this is where it's up to those of us in the public sector to keep an eye on those trend breaker situations and see how to handle those quick pivots that are occurring.
Mm-hmm. They may be related or not related, so how about deregulation then on the national level? It kind of ebbs and flows and changes during the years. Where is it today? Does it serve now to promote that kind of innovation from firms like Amazon, others? Has it gone too far? How do you think about deregulation on the national level with freight today?
That would require probably a deeper dive, something maybe Eno wants to take on as a particular research topic. But certainly some of the focuses have changed because we really have been encouraging, for example, more environmentally sustainable practices and other items in technology and so forth. So the public sector can encourage, and again, they set the playing field. So there are ways of encouraging the certain practices. Think of the Smart Rate program from EPA, and also addressing industry concerns. I mentioned about truck parking, or the shortage of attracting and both retaining truck drivers. So there are a variety of ways that the public sector can get involved, and we've seen that with. They had to go in and regulate the railroads in the 19th century. We get to the 20th century and they're rescuing the railroads. So again, we're pivoting with what's happening and thinking through, again, where the system of systems fits in with our economic growth and well-being.
Indeed, and the changes have been dramatic over the years, for sure.
And they will continue to be so.
The only thing that's constant, right? And you mentioned workforce, so let's collect a couple of these questions about workforce. So you noted the issues around drivers and what's going on to encourage more folks in the workforce there. You mentioned you had a note about automation. I think it was Lillian's question around what's happening in some of the ports there and people shifting from some jobs to another. How much do you think that automation is going to result in no net job loss? And what other kind of new jobs do you think would supplant those jobs that are changed from automation?
Even before the pandemic, we had critical shortages of labor in every aspect of the supply chain and production. If you talk about industrial real estate, the key location considerations are labor, labor, labor. Can you get the workers there? It's not just where you're located. Can you get the jobs? And when we think about a change in technology in a circumstance like that, we're talking about retaining and upskilling people. So it's not necessarily a loss in jobs. It's changing the nature of the jobs and providing mechanisms for the workforce to upskill themselves or be available for those kind of jobs. And I think a lot of companies are doing that. They're creating pathways and transferable credentialing and ways of really encouraging people into, again, going back to the 1960s, most of us would have been in manufacturing, production, or distribution. We moved away from that. We're now the point and click society. But now it's really, how do we encourage people to consider transportation, logistics, distribution, and production as viable career options, whether we're talking about hourly unskilled to highly skilled logistics professionals. We need all of them, particularly as we're talking about expanding our domestic production capability in certain areas.
Is there somebody doing that well? Is there somebody who stands out, or how do we think about the best efforts to do that, to build that network?
Well, let me first start at a federal level. As part of that advisory committee at the Department of Commerce, we started bringing together various departments, whether it was DOL, DOE, DOD, DOT, just keep going on the departments. Every department had an element. And we see this now where they're all coming together. There's a recognition that if we don't address the workforce issues, we can't accomplish what we need in our supply chains these days. So that's what's happening at a national level. At a local level, again, I'll point to the Council on Port Performance and the Workforce Development Implementation Team, which includes public sector, private sector, educational organizations at all levels, really looking at how do we attract people into the industry, even starting to talk to people in middle school about what's there, instructing teachers, providing that initial job readiness training, focusing more now than ever on those and increasing those last mile commutation connectivity options for workers. So there's a lot going on at local levels and a real focus on this at a national level, for that matter, the states as well.
I have one more question, Lillian. I want to see if anything else on your end before I ask one more question.
No, I think you've done a nice job in bringing together a whole bunch of threads that we've all focused on.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting. It's such a big, complex topic. A lot of the questions are kind of all over the place, and I want to end with one. Just to, and I'm only asking of you where you are there at the planning agency in North Jersey. So I feel like maybe there's some kind of connection. Folks are wondering. So given these changes and everything you mapped out very, very clearly, what does all this mean then on the ground in cities and in towns for the shopping district, right? Like you have main streets with stores and everything. If we're moving to this new kind of model, point and click, as you just mentioned, what is that? How does that play out on the ground in places? And have you seen that in northern New Jersey in places? Is that permanent, or is it something else coming back?
It's a great question, Rob. And one thing about resilience, something we've learned at looking at disruptions, up to 60% of local businesses are lost after a major disruption has occurred. And these are pre-pandemic analyses, and not in our area. These are studies around the world. So I think there's a recognition of not just business continuity, but community continuity. So I think we all saw in our communities a real drive to engage our local businesses, get food from local stores, buy locally, because we want to preserve that substance that makes our communities special. So I do think there's a recognition of that. And I look at the internet as a two-edged sword. So if you're in a rural area, all of a sudden you have access to all these goods that maybe you couldn't get before at reasonable prices. But say that you are starting a new business or you're a craftsperson on Etsy. Now you have virtual storefronts to add to your physical storefront. So this is where, again, we have a whole new stage for the retail environment. And we've seen a lot of conversations about going into stores for the experience. I mean, there's clothes you want to try on. You want to see if that sofa feels right. So you go for the experience. There's a reason you go to somewhere. There are things that you do shop online. But as you can tell, this is not something that happened overnight. We've been changing how we buy things for decades now. And we're going to continue to change that going into the future.
It certainly is. To your point, the change is constant, and it's going to continue to change. I think that's right.
Absolutely.
And I feel challenged here because I'm sure we could have covered way more than an hour, but we're right at our time. I want to thank everybody for the great questions, and thank you so much, Anne and Lillian, for participating in this webinar. I learned a whole lot. Opus is a new phrase I didn't know before, and I'm certainly going to remember that one. I just really appreciate you lending your expertise and all your wisdom to all of this. And for folks who don't know, Lillian herself was in leadership positions at the Port Authority, New York, New Jersey. So there's an awful lot of experience and smarts here on the webinar today.
Well, Rob, we were colleagues there, so I look forward to catching up with Anne in person soon.
Very good. Thank you so much again, and thank you all for participating. As I said, you can find slides and recording of this webinar on our website, enotrans.org. The recording will be emailed to all the registrants, hopefully within a day, certainly by the end of the week. I do want to make sure you sign up for our mailing list to gain access to all the free content, including our Eno Connector newsletter, our webinar announcements, report releases, and much more. And if you do enjoy this free webinar series, you can support Eno's work on the link on our website at enotrans.org. Again, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much, Lillian, for joining us here today and sharing your leadership and your stories. Thank you to the audience, and I want to wish you all the very best. Have a great day,
Thank
everybody.
you.